Welcome to another English Solutions for Business and Life video. Today, we will be looking at Unit 9 from the Global Pre-Intermediate book, and we will be focusing on the grammar section. Now, let's look at what we're going to see in this video. Firstly, we will focus on modal verbs of advice, how to give advice and make suggestions. We will also look at could, couldn't, had to, and didn't have to, and how we use these words. We're just going to see a few examples. Now, we're also going to look at past perfect and reported statements, or when we say what another person says. So, let's begin. Firstly, let's look at the modal verbs of advice. We use should or shouldn't and an infinitive without to give advice and make suggestions. For example, you should sleep at least 8 hours a day. Here we're using should and sleep. This is an affirmative sentence, and if you see, sleep is in the infinitive tense. Now, I mentioned that it's an infinitive without a to because you should to sleep would be wrong. Now, we use shouldn't, as you can already guess, for negative sentences, for advices that are against doing something. For example, you shouldn't go out in the cold. Again, we use an infinitive verb without the to. Now, you may also hear the phrase, I don't think or I think someone should. This is also a suggestion. We could apply it to these sentences over here. Now, keep in mind that in this case, we do not use the shouldn't for these advices. We instead use should. So, in the case of negative sentences, we use should, and we would use the negative form of this phrase. I don't think. I'm going to put it here. So it would go like this. I don't think you should go out in the cold. That's a suggestion saying that someone shouldn't go out in the cold. Now, in the case of positive sentences or affirmative sentences, like the one we have on top, we would keep it as it is. I mean, with the affirmative verb should. And just the I think. I think you should sleep at least 8 hours a day would be another suggestion or another verb phrase of advice. Now, there are some other words, such as ought and must. These words have a similar meaning to should, but, for example, ought is more formal. Should is more common. You could say, I ought to take an aspirin, or I should take an aspirin. Now, ought is used with the infinitive verb, as I mentioned over here. But here you do use the to before the infinitive verb. I ought to do something. Now, for the verb must, it's similar to should, but it is stronger and more definite. For example, you must take an aspirin. Notice that we don't use to before the infinitive verb. You must take an aspirin. Or going back to this example, you ought not watch TV without your glasses. Notice that in the negative form of this phrase, the not would go between the to and infinitive verb and the ought. In the case of must, is the same usage as should and shouldn't. Now let's look at the use of could, couldn't, and had to, didn't have to. Could and couldn't are used to talk about things that were possible or not possible in the past. For example, when I was in the hospital, I couldn't get out of bed. That's a negative sentence. That means that it wasn't possible or it wasn't allowed to get out of bed. In the second sentence, we could have visitors in the afternoon, which means that it was possible. We could have visitors in the afternoon. Now let's look at had to and didn't have to. Had to is the affirmative form and didn't have to is the negative form. We use had to or didn't have to talk about a past obligation, while we use could and couldn't for a thing that was possible or not possible in the past. Both are in the past, but one is what's possible or not possible, and the other one is an obligation. For example, I had to take tablets for a long time. That means that it was an obligation, something that must have been done in the past. Now, the second example is I didn't have to stay in the hospital that long. I didn't have to would mean that it wasn't an obligation to stay in the hospital for a long time. I hope this is clear, the use of could and couldn't, and had to and didn't have to. If you have any more questions, make sure you ask your teacher about it. Now let's look at how to use past perfect. We use past perfect to talk about an event in the past that happened before another event in the past, in a specific time in the past. For example, he cried because they had lost the match. Here, the past perfect verb is had lost, the verb being lost and the auxiliary verb being had. Now, this is the common syntax that is used with past perfect. We normally use have in the past sense and the verb also in the past sense. Both of them are in the past, the two verbs. Now, notice that the past perfect is used when you're talking about an event that happened before another event in the past. Both of these events are in the past, but the one in past perfect was before the other event. Now, when you use before or after in a sentence, You don't have to use the past perfect. You can rather use the past simple, because then the order of the events would be clear. But they will still have the same meaning. You could still use the past perfect, but it's not necessary. For example, before I started doing regular sport, I was overweight. That would be the past simple. First, I was overweight. Then I started doing regular sport. You can see the order of the events. Now, you could also use the past perfect. I had been overweight, and then I started doing regular sport. They both have the same meaning. One is with past perfect, and the other one is with past simple. You could still use them, and they would still have the same meaning. Now finally, let's look at reported statements. What are reported statements? We use reported statements to say that what another person said. For example, I'm not feeling well. If I say I'm not feeling well, you could say he said that he wasn't feeling well. This would be you, and this would be me. You're saying what I said before. Now, in reported statements, the tense changes. Verbs would go one tense backwards. What does this mean? For example, when you hear a sentence in present simple, the direct statement, the reported statement would be in past simple. For example, I'm not going to write this example, but listen. I like your new hairstyle would be the present simple. She said she liked my new hairstyle would be the past simple. Now, present continuous would turn into past continuous. Present continuous sentence would be I'm getting married. Past continuous sentence would be he said he was getting married. Present perfect would turn into past perfect. A present perfect sentence would be we've bought the tickets. A past perfect sentence would be she said that they had bought the tickets. Past simple turns into past perfect. A past simple sentence would be I missed the bus. A past perfect sentence would be he said he had missed the bus. Will would turn into would. Will sentence could be I'll see you later. Would sentence would be she said she would see me later. And future sentences, for example, am, is, or are going to, would turn into was or were going to. For example, I'm going to join a gym would turn into she said she was going to join a gym. Notice also that there are other words that change. For example, pronouns. If I'm saying it, I'm not feeling well, you would change the pronoun and you would say he. That's a pretty simple part. Also places. Places change. If I said in the train station, I'm here to wait for the train, and you're no longer at the train station, you could say he said He was there to wait for the train. This and that would also change. For example, I've just bought this book would turn into he said he had just bought that book. Also times. I met her last week would turn into he said he had met her the week before. You have to be very careful with these, as it could change the meaning of what you're saying. Now, another thing you might want to be careful with is the difference between say and tell. Do you know? We say something to someone, we tell somebody or someone about something. So just remember these two. We say something and we tell someone. That's pretty much it for this grammar part for Unit 9. I hope it was easier to understand now that you have watched this video. And if you have any more questions, make sure you ask your teacher about it. That's it for this video. See you in next video.